The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the quiet street of Willowbrook. Benjamin Carter, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, walked briskly, his polished shoes tapping steadily on the pavement. He was focused on the business meeting he was heading to, unaware that Officer Dean Mitchell was observing him from across the street. Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he watched Benjamin, his suspicion growing with each step the well-dressed man took. Benjamin's confident stride caught the officer's attention, and Mitchell couldn't help but notice the designer's suit and gleaming watch. To Mitchell, there was something inherently wrong with seeing someone like Benjamin in a neighborhood like this. The officer's expression hardened as he decided to make his move. "Hey, you there!" Officer Mitchell called out, his voice sharp and commanding. Benjamin stopped mid-step, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face the officer. His hand subtly hovered near his briefcase, unsure of the officer's intentions. "Yes, officer? Can I help you?" Mitchell approached, his gaze moving over Benjamin's attire with a slow, calculated scrutiny. The officer's demeanor was condescending, his tone tinged with suspicion. "Where are you headed?" he asked, forcing politeness into his voice, but failing to mask the underlying hostility. Benjamin stood tall, maintaining a calm but firm stance. "I'm on my way to a business meeting," he replied, his voice steady. "A business meeting?" Mitchell repeated, his disbelief evident. "And what kind of business do you do exactly?" Benjamin straightened his shoulders, keeping his expression neutral. "I don't see how that's relevant, officer. I'm just walking down the street." Mitchell took another step closer, his eyes narrowing with increasing doubt. "It's just funny," he said sarcastically. "A guy like you, in a suit like that, doesn't really fit in around here, does he?" Benjamin could feel his patience slipping, but he remained composed. "Is there a law against wearing a suit in this neighborhood, officer?" Mitchell sneered, shaking his head. "No," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But it sure makes me wonder. Maybe you're just passing through, or maybe you're up to something else." Benjamin stood his ground, not allowing himself to be intimidated. "I assure you, officer, I'm just going about my day." Mitchell's gaze turned even colder as he stepped closer, his body language threatening. "Got any ID on you?" he asked, his voice laced with contempt. Benjamin hesitated for a moment, but then reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his wallet. He handed over his ID, maintaining eye contact. "Here you go," he said, his voice calm but firm. Mitchell took the ID with exaggerated care, scanning it briefly before glancing at Benjamin with a slight, mocking smile. "Benjamin Carter. That name sounds familiar," he said, though his tone made it clear he wasn't impressed. "Am I free to go now, officer?" Benjamin asked, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. Mitchell didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another step closer, almost invading Benjamin's personal space. "Not so fast," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "I've got a few more questions for you." Benjamin's patience was starting to wear thin, but he refused to show it. "I don't see why that's necessary. I haven't done anything wrong." Mitchell chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "That's what they all say. But you? A guy like you, walking around in a fancy suit, something doesn't add up. The watch, the suit. Seems like you think you're above everyone else." Benjamin's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't think I'm above anyone, officer. I'm just living my life." Mitchell leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a more threatening whisper. "I'm implying that someone like you doesn't get all that," he said, gesturing to Benjamin's watch and suit. "Without doing something shady, maybe it's all stolen. Wouldn't surprise me." Benjamin felt his blood pressure rise, but he didn't let it show. "Everything I own, I've earned," he said, his voice sharp but controlled. Mitchell's eyes narrowed further, his lips curling into a cruel smirk. "Sure you did," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "People like you always have an excuse. Always a story. But I'm not buying it." Benjamin's patience snapped. He took a slow breath, his voice steady as he faced Mitchell. "You don't know anything about me, officer." Mitchell's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, sneering. "Oh, I know enough," he said, his voice rising slightly with anger. "I know you think you're untouchable, walking around here like you own the place." The tension between the two men grew thick, but Benjamin stood firm, refusing to be intimidated. "I don't think I'm untouchable," he said calmly, "but I do know that you have no right to treat me this way." Mitchell's anger flared, but Benjamin remained unshaken. The officer was playing a dangerous game, one Benjamin knew he could win. The silence between Benjamin and Officer Mitchell grew thick, as if the entire street held its breath. Benjamin's calm, controlled demeanor stood in stark contrast to Mitchell's simmering hostility. For a brief moment, Benjamin thought about walking away, but the officer's posture, his hand hovering near his belt, made him wary. He wasn't sure what Mitchell was thinking, but he knew one thing for sure: the situation was far from over. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Mitchell's voice was laced with sarcasm and suspicion, his eyes narrowing. Benjamin held his ground, his shoulders squared. "I'm not walking away, officer. I'm simply asking if I'm free to go." His tone was firm, but there was an underlying sense of restraint, as though he were trying to diffuse an escalating situation. Mitchell took another step closer, his breath heavy. "You're acting like you own this place, Carter," he said, his voice thick with contempt. "A guy like you in a suit like that, strutting around? What do you expect me to think?" Benjamin felt his patience fraying, but he refused to react. "You're assuming a lot about me, officer. You don't know me." Mitchell let out a short, humorless laugh. "I don't need to know you," he replied, his voice lowering. "I've seen guys like you before. You think you can get away with anything, just because you're dressed nice or wear a fancy watch." He looked at Benjamin's wrist, the disdain clear in his eyes. "Must be nice to have all that. But guys like me, we see the truth behind the facade." Benjamin didn't flinch. He had dealt with this type of prejudice before. But something about Mitchell's words made him bristle. The officer's assumptions weren't just an insult, they were an accusation. Benjamin had worked hard to get where he was, and it seemed Mitchell couldn't stomach the idea of a black man achieving success. "Do you even know who I am, officer?" Benjamin's voice was calm, but there was a steeliness to it that caught Mitchell off guard. The officer looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I know what I see. You're just another guy who thinks the world owes him something." Benjamin's gaze sharpened. "You're wrong." His voice was firm, unwavering. "I've worked for everything I have. Nothing has been handed to me." Mitchell's eyes narrowed further, his expression hardening. "I'm sure you did," he said almost mockingly. "But tell me something, Carter. How does someone like you afford all this?" He motioned to Benjamin's suit, the polished shoes, the gleaming watch. "You're not exactly in a part of town where guys like you typically hang out." Benjamin's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "What's your point, officer?" Mitchell paused for a moment, studying him. There was something about Benjamin's composed demeanor that seemed to make him uncomfortable. His suspicion grew, feeding his resentment. "You've got the suit, the watch, everything a guy could want," he muttered. "But you don't belong here. Maybe you're just passing through, or maybe you're up to something." He took a step closer, his tone growing more menacing. "Something shady." Benjamin felt a rush of heat flood through him, but he didn't let it show. "I'm not up to anything," he replied firmly. "I'm just a man going about his business, officer. You're the one making this a problem." Mitchell's smirk returned, colder now. "Sure, that's what they all say," he sneered. "You expect me to believe you're just another guy out for a stroll, wearing that expensive suit and walking like you own the place?" Benjamin's patience was nearly spent. "I'm not here to argue with you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." Mitchell looked Benjamin up and down one more time, his gaze lingering on the suit, the watch, the way Benjamin carried himself. To the officer, it was a provocation, an insult. A black man in such expensive clothes didn't fit his narrow view of the world. "Where's your ID?" Mitchell demanded abruptly, his voice rising. Benjamin hesitated, his frustration growing, but he complied, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out his ID. He handed it over without hesitation, his eyes meeting Mitchell's with a steady gaze. He could feel the tension in the air, the officer's hostility radiating off him, but he didn't back down. Mitchell studied the ID, his eyes scanning it slowly. "Benjamin Carter," he muttered, his tone laced with skepticism. "I've heard that name before." He glanced up at Benjamin, a sneer forming on his lips. "But I don't believe it." Benjamin crossed his arms, his expression unwavering. "Am I free to go now, officer?" Mitchell's lips curled into a tight smile. "Not so fast," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "I think I need to ask a few more questions." Benjamin felt the anger rising in his chest, but he held it in check. This was starting to feel like a deliberate harassment. "I don't see why this is necessary," he said evenly, trying to keep his composure. "I haven't done anything wrong. You've got my ID, so why don't you just let me go?" Mitchell stepped closer, his voice laced with venom. "Because I don't trust you," he said, his eyes cold. "You're not fooling me, Carter. People like you don't belong in a place like this." Benjamin's fists clenched at his sides, but he took a deep breath. He had to remain calm, stay focused. He couldn't let Mitchell get the better of him. "I'm not here to prove anything to you, officer," he said quietly, "but I think it's clear that you're the one with the problem." Mitchell took a step back, his eyes flashing with anger. The moment had come to a head, and Benjamin could feel it in his bones. Something was about to snap. The tension in the air was thick, nearly palpable. Benjamin could feel his pulse quickening as Officer Mitchell's hostile gaze bore into him. He had tried to remain calm, but something in Mitchell's eyes told him the officer wasn't going to let him go easily. Mitchell's posture was rigid, his hand still hovering near his side, as though he were waiting for any excuse to escalate the situation. Benjamin's mind raced, trying to calculate his next move. He was aware of how delicate this moment was, how quickly things could spiral out of control. "I told you," Benjamin said, his voice low and controlled. "I'm just trying to get to my meeting. I've done nothing wrong." Mitchell's lips twisted into a sneer. "Yeah, right," he muttered, shaking his head. "That's what they all say." Benjamin held his ground, refusing to be intimidated. "You don't have any reason to stop me, officer," he said, his voice steady. "You're harassing me for no reason." Mitchell stepped closer, his eyes narrowing further. The officer's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "Maybe I think you're hiding something. Maybe you're not the innocent businessman you claim to be." Benjamin's stomach twisted with frustration, but he refused to give Mitchell the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. "What are you implying, officer?" he asked, his tone sharp, though still calm. "I'm implying that guys like you don't get all this," Mitchell said, his voice dripping with disdain. "The watch, the suit, the attitude. You're too good to just be walking around here. You think I don't see what you're up to?" Benjamin's jaw clenched, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I've earned everything I have," he said, each word laced with steel, "and I'm not here to entertain your assumptions." But Mitchell was already beyond reasoning. The officer's face twisted with anger, his patience worn thin. "I don't care if you've earned it or not," Mitchell spat, his voice rising. "You don't belong here, and I'm sick of people like you thinking they can just do whatever they want." Benjamin's heart rate quickened, and a flicker of unease sparked within him. This wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding. This was something deeper, something much more dangerous. "I've done nothing wrong," Benjamin said again, keeping his voice steady. "I'm not the one breaking the law here. You are." Mitchell's expression darkened, and Benjamin saw his hand move slightly, inching toward his belt. "You think you're above me?" Mitchell said, his voice rising in volume. "You think you can walk away whenever you feel like it?" Before Benjamin could respond, Mitchell's hand shot out, grabbing his arm with unexpected force. Benjamin flinched, surprised by the suddenness of the move. "Where do you think you're going?" Mitchell growled, his grip tightening. Benjamin immediately pulled his arm back, trying to break free, but Mitchell's grip was too strong. Panic flared for a brief moment, but Benjamin fought to keep control. "I'm not resisting," Benjamin said, his voice calm but forceful. "You have no reason to stop me." Mitchell's eyes were wild with frustration. Without warning, his fist shot forward, connecting with Benjamin's jaw in a brutal punch. The force of the blow sent Benjamin stumbling back, his feet slipping on the pavement as pain exploded through his face. Benjamin's vision blurred momentarily, the shock of the punch leaving him disoriented. He reached up, his fingers brushing against his sore jaw, his heart pounding in his chest. Mitchell's eyes were filled with fury as he stepped forward, advancing on Benjamin with the look of a man who had just crossed a line. "You think you're better than me, huh?" Mitchell sneered. "You think you can just walk away from me?" Benjamin wiped blood from his lip, his mind racing as he steadied himself. He had been wrong to think this would stay civil. Mitchell was no longer interested in questioning him. This was personal now. "That was a mistake, officer," Benjamin said, his voice low and cold, the pain in his jaw only fueling his resolve. "You'll regret that." Mitchell smirked, but there was a touch of uncertainty in his eyes. "Oh, I don't think so, Carter," he retorted. "I'm the one with the power here, and I say you're under arrest." Benjamin clenched his fists, his pulse racing as he realized the gravity of the situation. He wasn't just being harassed now, he was being criminalized for no reason. His mind raced, calculating his next steps. "I haven't done anything wrong," Benjamin repeated, his voice firm and unwavering. "You don't have the right to arrest me." But Mitchell wasn't listening. The officer reached for his taser, his eyes flashing with malicious intent. "No one's coming to save you, Carter," Mitchell said with a sickening grin. "Out here, I'm the law." Benjamin didn't have time to react before the electric shock surged through his body. The taser's jolt hit him like a thunderclap, and his muscles seized involuntarily, dropping him to his knees. His vision flickered, and the pain made it hard to breathe as his body fought against the electrical current. Mitchell stood over him, watching with cruel satisfaction as Benjamin crumpled to the ground. "You think you can just walk around like you own the place?" Mitchell jeered. "Look at you now on your knees." Through the haze of pain, Benjamin managed to push himself up, his breath ragged and strained. His mind was racing. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about proving that he wouldn't let this man or anyone break him. "I'm not done, officer," Benjamin said quietly, his voice filled with quiet fury. "You've made a mistake, and I won't let it go." Mitchell scoffed, dragging Benjamin to his feet with a rough hand. "Oh, I'm sure you won't, but you're coming with me." Benjamin knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The drive to the police station was a blur. Benjamin sat in the back seat of the squad car, his wrists aching from the tight handcuffs, the sting of the taser still throbbing in his muscles. He stared out the window, trying to keep his mind calm, but his thoughts were a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. How had it come to this? All he had done was walk down the street on his way to a meeting, and now he was being treated like a criminal for no reason at all. His mind raced with strategies, with ways to take action, but he knew this was just the beginning. Mitchell had made his move, but Benjamin wouldn't back down. He had a purpose now. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up to the system, to the abuse of power that people like Mitchell were so quick to wield. As the squad car pulled into the parking lot of the station, Benjamin felt a cold sense of dread settle over him. He had been through a lot in his life, but being arrested and dragged through this system was a new kind of humiliation. Still, he kept his head high, refusing to let Mitchell see any weakness. The car came to a stop, and Mitchell immediately swung open the door. Without a word, he yanked Benjamin out of the car, his grip tight on his arm. The cold concrete under Benjamin's feet felt like it was pressing him down further, but he stood tall, his eyes sharp, scanning the surroundings. He could feel the eyes of the officers inside the station on him, some surprised, others curious, but he held his gaze steady. Mitchell didn't care about the stares. He shoved Benjamin toward the entrance, pushing him through the double doors with unnecessary force. Benjamin stumbled slightly but regained his footing quickly. He could feel the officer's satisfaction, the quiet smugness that Mitchell carried with him. "Bet this wasn't how you planned to end your day, huh?" Mitchell taunted, leaning in close, his voice low and mocking. Benjamin didn't respond. He didn't need to. Mitchell's words were just noise, a desperate attempt to assert dominance. Inside, the station was a far cry from the polished buildings Benjamin was used to. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered above, and the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. The low hum of conversation and the sound of phones ringing filled the background, but it all seemed distant to Benjamin as Mitchell pushed him toward a bench near the processing desk. "Sit," Mitchell growled, shoving Benjamin down onto the cold metal bench. The officer's eyes glinted with amusement, like a predator toying with its prey. Benjamin barely reacted, his posture erect and composed. He knew that he was being watched, that this was more than just a routine booking. It was a statement, but he wouldn't let it break him. Not now. As Mitchell walked away, Benjamin scanned the room. Several officers were seated at desks, their eyes flicking over to him as he sat there, his hands cuffed, his dignity intact. He could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty of the situation. But he had no intention of letting this defeat him. He knew the law, he knew his rights, and he wasn't going to let someone like Mitchell abuse his position without facing consequences. A few moments later, the sound of heels clicking on the floor drew Benjamin's attention. He turned his head to see a tall woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense expression walking toward him. She carried herself with confidence, her eyes scanning the room with a professional air that made her stand out from the other officers. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice firm but calm, "I'm Rebecca Langston, your lawyer." She gave him a reassuring nod, though her gaze quickly shifted to Mitchell, who had returned to his desk, watching them both with thinly veiled disdain. Benjamin exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Thank you for coming, Rebecca," he said quietly, though his voice carried the weight of what had just happened. He was grateful for her presence, but the reality of the situation was still sinking in. Rebecca didn't acknowledge Mitchell immediately. Instead, she turned to Benjamin, her face softening just slightly. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with concern. Benjamin gave a small nod, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. "I'm fine. But this isn't over, Rebecca. I'm not going to let Mitchell or anyone else get away with this." She studied him for a moment, her gaze sharpening. "Good. We're not going to let them get away with it either." Her tone turned more businesslike as she moved toward the desk to gather information. Benjamin watched her, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He had always prided himself on his composure, on his ability to stay calm under pressure. But as Rebecca turned back to him with a folder in hand, he knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. This was about holding people like Mitchell accountable and making sure that no one else would suffer the way he had. Mitchell had made a mistake, a big one. "I've got the preliminary paperwork," Rebecca said as she returned to Benjamin's side. "I've already spoken with some of the officers here, though they weren't very forthcoming. But I gathered enough to know that Mitchell doesn't have much of a case. His excuse for probable cause is flimsy at best. This is going to fall apart." Benjamin's lips tightened into a grim smile. "Good. Let's make sure he understands that this isn't just about me." His voice grew firmer, a trace of steel in his tone. "This is about reform, about making sure people like Mitchell are held accountable." Rebecca gave him a nod of agreement. "We'll get this sorted, and we'll make sure everyone sees what's happening here." As they stood to leave, Benjamin's mind was already working, planning the steps they would take next. Mitchell's actions might have brought him here, but they were only the beginning of the fight. The real work was just getting started. The station buzzed with activity, but Benjamin and Rebecca were focused, a quiet determination radiating from both of them as they left the processing room. The officers who had seen Benjamin arrive were still casting furtive glances in his direction, but he ignored them. His mind was already shifting to the next phase, what came after the arrest. Rebecca held the door open for Benjamin as they exited the room. She had already made calls, gathered initial information, and secured a legal team that would assist in building their case. But for Benjamin, this wasn't just about getting out of trouble. It was about something bigger. The system needed to change, and he had the resources to make sure that change happened. "Are you sure about this, Benjamin?" Rebecca asked as they made their way down the hallway. "This isn't going to be easy. It's going to take time, and it's going to be messy." Benjamin didn't hesitate. His voice was steady, but there was an unyielding resolve in his words. "I'm sure, Rebecca. Mitchell's actions were just the catalyst. This is about reforming a broken system. I won't stand by and let this happen to anyone else." Rebecca paused for a moment, taking in his words. She had worked with him for years, and though she knew his drive, she could sense the weight of this decision pressing down on him. "I've seen this before, Benjamin. I've seen people like Mitchell, people who abuse their power because they think they can get away with it. You're doing the right thing, but I need you to understand how much this is going to cost us, both personally and professionally." Benjamin didn't flinch. "I've already paid that price, Rebecca. This isn't just about me anymore." The two of them made their way to the parking lot where Benjamin's car was waiting. As they approached, Benjamin's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw an incoming call from one of his trusted allies in the city council. "Benjamin, it's Lisa," the voice on the other end said. "I've heard what happened. We're ready to help. This is bigger than just you. We're starting to gather a coalition for police reform, and we're bringing in community leaders, legal experts, and activists who are ready to fight. We want you to be the face of this movement. What do you need from us?" Benjamin could hear the fire in Lisa's voice, and it sparked something in him. This was the kind of momentum he needed. "Thank you, Lisa. Right now, I need the support of everyone I can get. We're going to demand real change in this department and in this city. This isn't just about Mitchell. This is about holding everyone who abuses their power accountable. I'll be in touch." As he hung up the phone, Benjamin could feel a weight lifting off his shoulders. They weren't just going to fight this from the inside. They were going to take this to the people, to the community, and make sure that Mitchell wasn't the only one who faced consequences. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "A coalition, huh?" Benjamin smiled, though it was tight. "The system has been broken for too long. It's time to fix it. We'll need to collect evidence, testimonies, and work with the community leaders to push for the reforms that are long overdue." "I'm all in," Rebecca said, her voice resolute. "Let's get to work." They drove to Benjamin's office where the team was already gathered. The room was filled with people he trusted, legal experts, fellow investors who had been watching the situation closely, and community organizers who had been pushing for change in the city for years. They all knew what had happened to Benjamin, and they were ready to take action. The conversation was intense. Ideas flowed rapidly as they brainstormed the most effective ways to move forward. They discussed drafting legislation for better police oversight, the creation of independent review boards, and mandatory anti-bias training for officers. It was a monumental task, but everyone in the room knew it was necessary. "We need to be strategic," Benjamin said, pacing in front of the whiteboard. "This has to go beyond just the department. We need to address the culture of policing in this city. It's about accountability, transparency, and trust. We need the community to feel like they have a voice in how the police operate. That's how we make change." Rebecca leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "We'll need media support to keep this in the public eye. We can't let them brush this under the rug. This isn't just a legal battle, it's a social one. We need to show that people care. We need the people to feel like this is their fight too." Benjamin nodded. "Exactly. We'll need to be vocal. We'll need to march, hold town halls, and get the press on our side. This will be messy, but we'll make sure everyone knows the truth. Mitchell's arresting me was just the beginning, but we'll make sure it's the end of a much larger issue." Hours passed as they discussed every possible angle: media strategies, community engagement, and legal pathways. The room was buzzing with energy, the urgency of their mission filling the air. Benjamin felt his resolve strengthen with each passing minute. They were creating something bigger than just a lawsuit. They were creating a movement. As the meeting wrapped up, Rebecca approached Benjamin. "You sure about this, Benjamin? You're about to open up a can of worms. Once this takes off, there's no going back." Benjamin smiled, though there was a fire in his eyes. "I'm ready. It's time to take the fight to the streets. We'll win this, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been unfairly targeted." Rebecca nodded. "Then let's make it happen." The next morning, Benjamin was back at his office, facing the reality of what was about to unfold. His phone buzzed with text messages and emails, mostly from his network of allies and community leaders, all eager to take action. They were ready, and so was he. The stakes were high, but for the first time, Benjamin felt like he was on the right side of history. Rebecca had spent the entire night drafting the first wave of formal complaints and requests for investigation into Officer Mitchell's conduct. She had already lined up a meeting with the local press, who were eager to cover the story. Benjamin's goal was clear. He wanted to expose the rotten culture in the police department, and he wasn't going to rest until Mitchell, and anyone like him, was held accountable. But first, Benjamin had one more thing to do. He needed to confront Mitchell, face to face. They arranged a meeting with the chief of police, Randall Graves. Benjamin walked into the room with a purpose, his head high, his back straight. He wasn't going to let them hide behind the thin veneer of protocol anymore. The people were watching, and they would demand justice. He could feel it in his gut that Mitchell was about to face the consequences of his actions. Rebecca stood beside him, her sharp eyes scanning the room as they walked through the police station. They were met with cold stares from officers who looked at Benjamin like he didn't belong. But they were just spectators now, caught in the crossfire of a fight much bigger than any one individual. Chief Graves appeared from behind a door and gestured for them to enter his office. He was a large man, a little over 6 feet tall, with a solid frame that exuded authority. But there was a tightness in his eyes that told Benjamin everything he needed to know. He had heard the rumors, and he knew exactly why they were here. "Mr. Carter," Graves said, his voice level but carrying an edge of unease. "Miss Langston, please take a seat." Benjamin gave a curt nod and sat down, his posture confident, unyielding. He didn't take his eyes off the chief. "Let me start by saying," Graves began, leaning forward in his chair, "that I understand the gravity of the situation. Officer Mitchell's actions are under investigation, and we will be taking it seriously. This is not reflective of the department's values." Benjamin leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm. "That's not enough, Chief Graves. Mitchell isn't the only one who's failed here. This isn't just about one officer. This is about a culture of abuse, a culture of power that's been allowed to run rampant for far too long. Mitchell is just one piece of a much bigger problem." Graves shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Benjamin wasn't finished. "I want you to know that I'm not here just to have a meeting and let this slide. I'm here to make sure that this department answers for what it's done. I'm going to hold each and every one of you accountable if you don't make real change, and I'll do it in front of the entire city if I have to." Rebecca stood beside Benjamin, her voice cutting through the tension. "We're not just asking for a review, Chief. We're asking for real action. This goes beyond one man. This is about accountability, transparency, and reform. The people are tired of being told they'll be heard and then ignored." Graves exhaled heavily, clearly uncomfortable under their scrutiny. "I understand your concerns, but you have to realize the pressure we're under. Policing isn't easy, Mr. Carter. We deal with situations every day that are difficult to understand unless you've been in our shoes." Benjamin's eyes hardened. "I don't need to be a cop to understand right from wrong. Mitchell's actions were wrong. The system that allowed him to do this is wrong. And I'm not going to let this go quietly, Chief. If you don't take this seriously, we will bring this to the public. We will bring it to the courts, and I'll make sure the media picks this up so the world sees exactly what's happening here." The chief cleared his throat, and for a moment it seemed as though he might try to dismiss Benjamin's words. But then he paused, his gaze shifting uneasily from Benjamin to Rebecca and back again. He could feel the weight of Benjamin's words and the certainty in his eyes. "I'm telling you, Chief," Benjamin said, his tone unwavering, "this is your chance to do the right thing, because if you don't, you're going to be held responsible, just like Mitchell. I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever." There was a long silence in the room, and Benjamin could sense that the chief was at a crossroads. Graves had a choice: stand with the status quo and defend the indefensible, or do what was right and face the consequences of a deeply flawed system. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Graves sighed and placed his hands on the table. "You're right, Mr. Carter. Officer Mitchell has crossed a line. We will initiate an internal investigation, and I'll personally ensure that everything is handled properly." Benjamin nodded, satisfied but not fully appeased. "That's a start, Chief, but this isn't just about one man. You need to change the system itself. You need to set up independent oversight, implement proper training, and make sure this never happens again." Graves leaned back, a weary look in his eyes. "We'll do what we can, but I want you to know I'm not ignoring the seriousness of this." Benjamin didn't smile. "Good, I'll be watching, and so will everyone else." As Benjamin and Rebecca left the chief's office, they both knew this was only the beginning. They had put pressure on the system, and for the first time, it seemed like the wheels of change might actually start turning. But the fight was far from over. They still had a long road ahead of them. The city was buzzing with rumors. The story of Officer Mitchell's actions had spread quickly, and Benjamin's name was now on everyone's lips. News outlets, social media, and even local community leaders were all talking about the case. The tide was shifting, and people were starting to pay attention to the issues Benjamin had been raising for years. This wasn't just about one man. It was about the broader culture of policing and systemic issues that had been allowed to fester unchecked. But while public sentiment was building, the real battle had just begun. Benjamin, Rebecca, and their team had a clear goal: to hold Mitchell accountable for his actions and to make sure this case served as the catalyst for sweeping change in the police department. It was a battle that would take time, resources, and immense public support. But Benjamin was determined. The next step was legal. Benjamin had hired one of the best litigation teams in the country, a group of attorneys who had handled high-profile cases and specialized in civil rights. They gathered in the conference room of Benjamin's office, ready to begin their strategy session. Rebecca sat beside him, her sharp mind already analyzing the next move. The stakes were higher now than they had ever been. "We need to make sure this case is airtight," one of the lead attorneys, Mark Sullivan, began. "We have to prove that not only was Mitchell's conduct inexcusable, but that the department knew about his behavior and did nothing to stop it." Benjamin nodded. "I want to make it clear that this isn't just about Mitchell. It's about the department's failure to address issues like his for years. We need to expose the system, not just the individual." Rebecca agreed, her expression focused. "The media has been on our side so far. The public opinion is strong, but we can't let that be the only thing that carries us through. We need evidence, witnesses, and a clear, compelling argument." Mark scribbled down some notes on the whiteboard. "We'll need statements from witnesses, surveillance footage if possible, and we'll have to dig into Mitchell's past conduct. This needs to be a thorough investigation." Benjamin's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was an update from the local news station. "It's starting," he said quietly as he read the message. "The city council is meeting tonight to discuss police reform in light of the recent events. They want me to speak." Rebecca gave him a small smile. "Looks like the momentum is already building. This is our chance to push for real change." Benjamin looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his team. They all knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about getting justice for him. This was about creating a legacy, one that would pave the way for future generations to live in a city that was truly free from the abuse of power. "We'll be ready," Benjamin said, standing up. "But it's not just about the legal fight. We need to be out there, in front of the community, letting them know we're not backing down. We need to organize rallies, marches, town halls, make sure people know their voices matter." Rebecca nodded in agreement. "We'll have a plan for that too. We've got a good support base, and I'm working with several local activists to get the word out. This isn't just your fight. This is everyone's fight." Benjamin felt the weight of it all, but he also felt a sense of clarity. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for a system that needed to be overhauled. If they could expose the cracks, they could change everything. "Let's get to work," he said, his voice determined. That afternoon, Benjamin and Rebecca made their way to the city hall, where a meeting had been scheduled to discuss police reform. The atmosphere in the building was charged with anticipation. The city council members were all in attendance, some looking uncomfortable at the pressure building around the case, others eager to address the growing calls for change. When it was Benjamin's turn to speak, he stepped up to the podium with a calm that belied the urgency of the moment. The room fell silent as he addressed the crowd, his voice carrying through the chamber. "Thank you, council members," Benjamin began, his words measured but firm. "I stand before you today not just as a businessman, but as a concerned citizen. I was wrongfully arrested, and I am here today because I want to make sure no one else has to go through what I went through. But this isn't just about me. This is about all the people in this city who've been unjustly targeted, who've been treated like criminals based on assumptions, prejudice, and a broken system." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The room was quiet, everyone listening intently. The actions of Officer Mitchell are not an isolated incident. They are the result of a culture that has allowed abuses of power to go unchecked. We can't ignore this anymore. We have the power to make a difference, to fix a system that's been broken for far too long, and that starts with holding people accountable, not just for what they did, but for what they allowed to happen under their watch. Benjamin's eyes scanned the room, locking on to the council members. "I'm asking you today to stand with me, with the community, and push for real police reform. We need independent oversight, we need transparency, And we need a system where the people's rights are protected, not violated. The room erupted into applause. Benjamin could see the change in the air. This was no longer just his fight, it was everyone's fight. The momentum from Benjamin's speech at City Hall had set the wheels of change in motion. The community was energized, the press was watching, and the city council was under pressure to act. But the fight was far from over. Officer Mitchell's suspension had been a small victory, but Benjamin knew it wouldn't be enough. He had to push harder, expose the deeper flaws in the system, and make sure real reforms were put in place. That afternoon, Benjamin found himself standing in a meeting room, his eyes fixed on the two people sitting across from him, Chief Randall Graves and Officer Mitchell. The tension in the room was palpable, like a storm ready to break. Mitchell, who had been placed on administrative leave after the investigation was launched, looked disheveled and defeated. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a sense of bitter resignation. Graves, on the other hand, sat stiffly, his face impassive but his body language revealing a nervous energy beneath the surface. He had agreed to this meeting with Benjamin to discuss the steps forward, but Benjamin knew that it wasn't just about the future. It was about holding everyone in that room accountable for the past. Benjamin didn't sit. He remained standing, his posture confident, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to demand accountability. "Let's get straight to the point," Benjamin said, his voice calm but firm. "Mitchell has crossed a line. This wasn't just a bad decision. It was part of a pattern of behavior that's been ignored for far too long. The department is responsible for allowing him to act with impunity, and that's why we're here today." Chief Graves shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "Mr. Carter, I understand your frustration, but we are addressing this. We are conducting an internal investigation, and—" Benjamin cut him off, his tone sharp. "No, Chief, that's not enough. An internal investigation isn't going to change anything. What happened to me, to others who've been treated the same way, isn't going to be fixed by just checking a box. We need real change. We need independent oversight. We need policies that will hold officers accountable for their actions, not just for what's in the report, but for the culture they perpetuate." He turned his gaze to Mitchell, who was still sitting quietly, his eyes downcast. "You," Benjamin said, addressing him directly, "are the face of a system that allows people like you to act with no regard for the rights of others. You may have punched me, but you've also punched the trust that should exist between law enforcement and the people they're supposed to protect." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding Benjamin's gaze. You didn't what, Mitchell?" Benjamin interrupted, his voice cold. "You didn't mean to? You didn't realize what you were doing? Or maybe you didn't care. It doesn't matter now. The truth is out, and now we're going to deal with the consequences." Mitchell's face flushed with anger, but Benjamin wasn't finished. "You think you're the only one who has the power in this room? Well, you're wrong. You're not untouchable. No one is, and I'm not going to let you get away with this." Graves seemed to shrink under the weight of Benjamin's words, but he cleared his throat and sat up straighter. "We're doing everything we can to address the issue," he said, his voice strained. "But what do you expect us to do, Mr. Carter? You're asking us to tear apart the whole department. That's not something we can just do overnight." Benjamin's eyes narrowed. "This is not about tearing apart the department. This is about building a new one. One that values accountability, transparency, and fairness. One that protects the community, not harasses it." He turned to Rebecca, who had been silently observing the exchange, her arms crossed. She had been working behind the scenes, building coalitions, drafting policy proposals, and coordinating with community leaders. Benjamin was grateful for her steady presence, but today the spotlight was on him. Rebecca spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Benjamin's right, Chief. It's not about punishment, it's about change. You can't continue to sweep these issues under the rug. This is a chance for the department to set an example. You have the power to make this right, but only if you take concrete steps to fix the system, not just patch it up." Graves sat back, his hands clasped in front of him. "I hear you," he said, his voice soft. "And I'm willing to work with you, Mr. Carter. We're committed to reform, but it's going to take time." Benjamin didn't hesitate. "We don't have time, Chief. People are watching. They want change, and they want it now. We've already waited too long. If we don't act now, we'll lose this moment, and I'll make sure the entire city knows who's responsible for letting this happen." Graves looked between Benjamin and Mitchell, then back at Benjamin. "I'll personally ensure that Mitchell faces the consequences. We will start implementing the reforms immediately, beginning with a complete review of the department's policies. But I need your help. I need you to stay with us in this process. We can't do this without your support." Benjamin's gaze softened just slightly, but his resolve was clear. "I'll support you as long as you're serious about this. But make no mistake, this is just the beginning. If I see any signs of backpedaling, if I see any signs that this department is going to continue enabling bad officers, I'll be back. And this time, it won't just be about me." The weeks that followed the meeting with Chief Graves were a whirlwind of activity. The media had latched onto Benjamin's story, and public support for the reforms he was pushing became a groundswell. People from all walks of life were demanding justice, not just for him, but for everyone who had been mistreated by a flawed system. Benjamin and Rebecca worked tirelessly, organizing town halls, meetings with community leaders, and public rallies to keep the pressure on. The city council was finally starting to listen, and the department was beginning to see the writing on the wall. For the first time in years, the public was unified in their demand for real change. But even as the tide turned in their favor, Benjamin knew this battle wasn't over. The fight for true reform would take time. There would be setbacks, pushback, and moments of doubt. But he was resolute. His commitment to seeing the process through, to holding those in power accountable, remained unwavering. One evening, as Benjamin sat in his office overlooking the city skyline, his phone buzzed with a notification. He checked it, and his eyes scanned the message. The investigation into Officer Mitchell's actions had concluded, and he had been formally dismissed from the force. But more than that, the police department had committed to a comprehensive overhaul of their policies, including mandatory anti-bias training, the establishment of an independent review board, and changes to how complaints were handled. It was a monumental victory, but Benjamin knew that it was just one step in a much larger journey. There were still countless issues to address in law enforcement and the justice system, and he wasn't going to stop until real, lasting change had been achieved. Rebecca entered the office, carrying a folder with the latest updates. She set it down on the desk and looked at Benjamin, her eyes filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. "It's happening," she said softly, almost in disbelief. "We've made a real difference." Benjamin leaned back in his chair, his hands folded. "It's just the beginning, Rebecca. Mitchell's firing was important, but it's only a small part of the larger picture. We've started something bigger, something that can change the way this city, and eventually this country, views justice and policing." Rebecca smiled, her admiration for him evident. "You've done more than just start something, Benjamin. You've sparked a movement. People are beginning to see that the system doesn't have to be like this. You've opened their eyes." Benjamin's gaze drifted out the window, his thoughts distant. "I'm not doing this for the recognition," he said quietly. "I'm doing this for everyone who doesn't have the voice or the resources to stand up. There are so many people who have been hurt by this system, and it's time for that to change." Rebecca crossed her arms, watching him. "And you're going to make sure it does, one step at a time." He nodded, his expression set with determination. "I will, because the fight isn't over. Not for me, not for anyone." Later that evening, Benjamin stood in front of a large crowd at a rally, speaking passionately about the reforms and the future they could build together. The crowd was loud, chanting, united in their call for justice. As Benjamin spoke, he could feel the energy in the air. This wasn't just a protest. This was a movement, one that would continue to grow, and one that Benjamin would lead with every ounce of his being. As the rally ended and the crowd dispersed, Benjamin stood for a moment, looking at the people who had gathered. He knew that this was a turning point. No longer would people like Mitchell be allowed to abuse their power without consequence. And with every step forward, they were proving that change was possible. Rebecca joined him, her face glowing with pride. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with respect. "You've started something that can't be stopped now." Benjamin turned to her, his eyes resolute. "It's not just me," he said. It's all of us. We've just begun to make the world we want to live in. As the evening sky darkened and the last of the crowd trickled out, Benjamin felt a quiet sense of pride wash over him. It wasn't the end of the battle, but it was a new beginning, one that he was ready to face head-on, knowing that every step forward would bring him closer to the world he wanted to create. A world where justice wasn't a privilege, but a right.